This is a stormwater utility workshop on pricing. We're going to have a presentation, I believe, from our Public Works Director. I'd ask the board members here that are present, if you would, I'd like to set aside a time from 5:15 to 5:45, 30 minutes for the presentation. And if you could hold your questions until that point, just write them down in case they're answered in the presentation. And let's try to reserve the time from 5:45 until 6 for a little Q&A here on it, because I imagine we're all going to have some questions. With that, I'll recognize our Public Works Director, Mr. Barlow.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Commissioners. We've talked about this, I think, for about a year and a half now. I remember we had our first work session talking about stormwater back in the spring of last year. We've been wanting to go this direction for several years now. And so I think this is a very pivotal meeting tonight where we talk about kind of, this is where the rubber meets the road. It's a utility and there's fees associated with it for us to be able to accomplish some of the things that we want to try to accomplish. And so with that in mind, I think this is a lot of numbers in here. And so I think that was good to, I'm sure there may be a lot of questions, but I think one of the good things is some of the questions may be answered through the remainder of the presentation. So for that, we have a pretty good presentation put together by our team from CDM Smith here. And so I think, David, I think you're going to be taking it and running with it. Appreciate it. Thanks, David.
All right. Thanks. Thanks, Andy. So we'll just go ahead and jump in. I'm Dave Mason from CDM Smith, the project manager for this program, and have implemented and help clients work on stormwater utilities all over Tennessee and the country. So I'm happy to be here today to talk to you a little bit more about stormwater utility program that we've developed for your city. So we're not going to go into as much detail as we did last time, because you guys heard a lot of that. But again, please, ask any questions here at the end for anything you need. Just a recap on where we're at. We've got really two phases to this project. The stormwater program assessment phase, which is a lot of what we presented last time, kind of gives a bit of the feasibility of the program. And then we've moved into some of the implementation steps here in the event that you may decide to move forward and start to really finalize what some of the numbers might be. So that's really what we're here to talk about today. So if you recall last time, we had worked with staff to summarize what the current spending and revenue needs of the program are today. This is just a summary slide. Again, you saw this last time. We'll work with staff to figure out where the costs are coming from, what types of programs you have in place today, and what kind of level of service that's delivering for the citizens. And so on average, on a typical year, spending a little over $700,000 on stormwater type programs. The one thing to note there is we don't have any money in capital, and that's been a place where the city hasn't been able to dedicate a lot of revenue towards larger capital projects to resolve some of the flooding issues. And so that's one of the areas that I know that Andy's looking to hopefully improve over time. And so as I noted before, we've done a lot of these programs throughout Tennessee and the country. So we help kind of benchmark where the program is today in comparison to others. This is by no means any kind of declaration about staff performance or the city in any way. It's really just an assessment of what kind of revenue you have in order to meet the needs that your citizens are asking for. And so we evaluated in each of these four programs, looking at program management, regulatory compliance, O&M, and capital. And so this is where we have the program ranked today. And really, this is an assessment of the program is mostly in a reactive mode. Calls come in, the city tries to respond as best as possible. As we noted, there's known flooding problems out there, but there's not enough revenue in the program today to tackle those. And so that's where we see the program today. And those are potential areas of improvement and things I know that Andy and his team are looking to address with a future program. And that's really why we're here talking today about that. So this is a slide, again, we presented last time that looks at what some higher levels of service are for a stormwater program. And there's programs and activities behind all these numbers, and we'll summarize a few of those here, but it kind of gives you a sense of where the program funding would need to be in order to move up that ladder from D to C, C to B. So on the right-hand side there are average annual program costs that may be required to fund a program at the level that the city ultimately desires to be. And so we've been, ultimately that defines a funding gap. So where you are today, funded to your general fund versus where you may need to be in the future, and whether it makes sense to continue to fund the program in the same type of way that you do now, or whether you look at some other revenue stream or an alternative revenue stream, which may be a stormwater utility funding program. And so we presented some different rate structure options last time. This is kind of the one we've zeroed in on for your community, a recommended approach, if you will. If you recall, we talked about an equivalent residential unit, and that's what the ERU stands for. And in that type of rate structure, we'd look at each individual residential dwelling unit would be the base that gets a base charge, and then everyone else that are non-residential would be charged in relation to that. And so we've done, this isn't a program we're just slapping on the city. We've done statistical sampling of your properties to understand exactly what that base unit would be for Mount Juliet. And so if you see that number there down at the bottom, the 3,050 square feet, that's the amount of the average amount of impervious area. So impervious area being buildings, rooftops, driveways, hard surfaces that water can't penetrate through, that runs off into the city street that you have to address. And so that's the average amount of impervious area for a residential dwelling unit in town. So, don't get that confused with heated space, or, 2-story house, 3-story house. This is the footprint on the ground. That's the driveway, the house, for a residential property. And then for your commercial properties, it's the parking lot, the building, all those kinds of things. And so anyway, this is a very typical rate structure for communities throughout the country. It's the easiest one to implement and maintain. So there's not a lot of administrative burden once you've implemented this to keep up with it. And so again, each residential dwelling unit would get charged one base charge, whatever that number may be. And we'll talk about there in a minute. And then for your non-residential properties, we've measured all of them. And so they'll get charged in relation to that. Just kind of quick example here. So again, if you look at the one on the left, if that's a typical residential property here in town, 3,050 square feet. If you look at the right, if that's a non-residential property, building, parking lot, what have you, and in this example, say it's 30,000 square feet, they would get charged 10 times the amount of the typical home, since they're generating 10 times the amount of runoff by having parking lot, a building, that sort of thing. So that's the concept of the fee, is always based around the amount of impervious area, since that's the closest thing we can correlate to the amount of runoff they generate, and then the system that the city's got to have in place to maintain that. So it's their burden on the system, or the amount of service that they're ultimately being provided. So again, going back to that chart that we had before, where should the city be? And so we've kind of discussed a lot of this with staff, and those green boxes are where the city ultimately feels like they want to be in terms of or at least city staff, in terms of a program and the types of things that they feel like they need in order to address the comments and concerns that you all hear and that they hear from citizens. And so the total program cost of that is about $2.2 or $2.3 million a year up at the top there. And so, moving up to level service B on program management and regulatory compliance, and then moving up to sort of the goal of having an A level program on the O&M and the capital side to address those issues. And we'll talk in a second about what's behind that. But beyond that, so that ultimately today, from development fees that the city's collecting, you're collecting about $400,000 a year in development fees. And so if we apply that to the program, the revenue need is about 1.9 million. So if we were to implement some kind of fee program on an ongoing basis, like a stormwater utility, you'd be looking to generate about 1.9 million a year, and not that 2.3, because you have some revenue coming in already. So just in terms of the types of things that you might see in an improved program, these are the things we've identified. First and foremost is having a dedicated and phased capital program, just like any of your other water sewer programs that you might have here. Really having a plan in place to tackle those larger flooding issues. And so that's really the number one benefit we see. That brings along reduced severity of flooding, reduced frequency of flooding citywide. And so that's really one of the top priorities. The second one being having dedicated maintenance crews to do projects throughout the city, and whether it's cleaning and repair of the system. Today, those crews are pulled off on many other things. They're not dedicated to stormwater. So if they're not available, projects don't necessarily get done. So the benefit you'd see there is having a reduced amount of nuisance flooding that are related to maintenance issues, and extend the life of your infrastructure that's out there. It'd be better maintained, last longer, presumably future savings and cost. Third, kind of on that, your program management side and your regulatory side, moving towards more of a proactive program where you're maintaining your assets proactively over time. So having a full and complete inventory of your system, understanding where there's deficiencies, and having a program in place to improve those over time. And then lastly, as with any other utility program, you'd want to have somebody leading that program directly, not portions of different folks' daily duties, so that it operates as it should. So those are kind of the four things that we identified in that $1.9 million that would move the city's program forward into a more proactive stormwater program. And so in order to do that, with that rate structure that we mentioned, here's kind of the numbers. So again, the base amount of impervious area that everyone would be charged based on would be that 3,050 square feet. And in order to generate about $1.9 million, you need to charge about $5.40 per month per equivalent residential unit. So again, a single family home, like $5.40 a month. Somebody that's living in an apartment, $5.40 a month. That's where the base charge would be. And then for those that are 5 times bigger, 10 times bigger, 20, they're going to get charged some proportion of that larger. And so that would generate about the $1.9 million a year that you would need to cover that funding gap. Here's a summary of the fees in Tennessee right now. I kind of highlighted the ones in orange as ones that are more Middle Tennessee area. I don't know if there's a pointer on here. Yeah, so you kind of see we're in the ballpark. A lot of the ones here in the Middle Tennessee area, Gallatin, Portland, Goodlettsville, Nashville, they're all in that $5 to $6 range. So you're kind of right there in the sweet spot of the ones around this area. Some of the ones that have been in place for a long time started off a bit lower, but what we're seeing nationally is that number's been moving up as more of these things are being implemented. So the national average is about $5 a month per residential structure. Tennessee's a little over $4 in the Middle Tennessee area. And so that covers the residential folks, but just kind of to give you an idea of the non-residential folks. So again, we talked about residential going to be $5.40 a month. Others play in proportion to that. So we've measured out all the non-residential properties, and looking at that, this is just a plot of those. And certainly you have your big guys that everyone's aware of. You're like your Under Armour and those types of places, Amazon. Those are these outliers up here. But most of the businesses throughout town and properties are non-residential. They're in this leg of the curve here. So about half of them are less than $50 a month in this rate structure. About 75% of them are less than $100 a month. So that just gives you a little perspective of what their charge would be in relation to what the typical residential home might be. And the last really thing is billing. And so we've talked a lot about billing here and how would you bill this? And there's multiple ways to do it. But ultimately, you have a billing system here in place already. That's most cost effective to leverage that. So we would propose adding that fee onto the sewer bill as you have it today, be collected monthly. So you have the revenue coming in frequently. The one challenge with that is it doesn't cover all of the city. So there's parts of the city that don't get this bill. And so you got to figure out how do you cover the other ones. We've talked to Wes Wilson about would it be possible to tag it on their bill. There's always a possibility of putting it on the tax bill. That's allowable in Tennessee. But ultimately, we think just continuing to expand this program and have stormwater only bills for now for these areas would be the most efficient way to do that. Those may not be billed monthly. Maybe we'd bill them every 6 months or once a year, just to kind of reduce the administrative burden of doing that. But that's where we are today with the billing side, and feel like that's probably the best approach for your community. So kind of moving forward, the steps that would happen after this. One is to kind of finalize the measurement of those impervious areas. There's things getting built every day, so it's keeping up with those and making sure we have everything in place by the time you bill. Develop that billing file that would work with your system. Certainly public outreach. Anytime you implement a new fee program, have some outreach, particularly those larger customers. We'd want to meet with them and show them a map of what we measured and understand if we make sure we've got everything correct for them. The other big piece and related to your non-residential folks is the state requires you to have some kind of credit manual for folks that are for anytime you implement a fee program like this. So just an example here, if they've got a detention pond on their property, that reduces the burden of their system on your system. So they would be entitled to a credit. And so we develop a policy for them to submit an application for consideration of a credit to reduce their fee if they're maintaining that. And then adopting an ordinance and doing some training of your staff to receive questions and maintain this over time. So those would be the next steps if you were to choose to move forward ultimately. So before we take questions, Aaron's going to jump up here. We talked about the capital program being important. And so in parallel to this, we've been working on a bit of a master plan that's going to support the fee program and ultimately provide you with a capital plan moving forward that these revenues would fund.
Thanks, Dave. My name is Aaron Rogge. I'm with CDM Smith. And in my dozen or so years doing these stormwater and sewer master plans throughout the Southeast, this may be one of the tougher ones I've done because my parents live here in Mount Juliet and they're expecting a really high quality plan from us. So they're a tough judge of these sorts of things. But what I'm really going to talk about tonight is how we're going to get this program into action, get shovels in the dirt, and do it wisely. Prioritize the right problems, prioritize them first, and get everybody on the road to a flood-ready community. So that's our little flood render there. That's the Belinda City, just east of Providence there, up through the southern parts of the city, I-40 there in the middle. Where are we in the development of this plan? So we have a hydrologic and hydraulic model that's been constructed. I won't bore you with the details of that. It's been validated to the FEMA floodplains that exist and observe flooding. We got several videos and pictures from folks in the community and from Shane and Andy that helped us to identify where we have chronic issues. And preliminarily, we call them alternatives in the business. Those are improvements to the drainage system in the community. We've preliminarily drawn up some of these. So the next step is to determine what we call the appropriate level of service, which is understanding what is too much to do in a certain situation and where we really need to do things first. It's phasing, it's comparing solutions and trying to get the right solutions for your community. This picture up here on the top right, that is right there in Sunnymead and Belinda Parkway right there. That's a pretty small box. I've seen several videos of that thing getting full. It's a frequent situation. So we're going to be looking on a micro level at places like that. But then to solve the really big problems, a big storm event, the screenshot below there is an example of a constructed wetland in a large detention area down in Franklin. That's Franklin Pike and Mallory Lane. So in order to really try to tackle some of the bigger problems, those are some of the long-term horizon projects that would benefit the community and really keep Calabria pizza in business, if you will. So what are we considering when we talk about alternatives? Storage and detention are the big ones. You know, a big hole in the ground is still kind of the best way to solve a flooding problem. There's a lot of innovations out there, but if we're talking about a really heavy rainfall event, getting it offline and keeping it out of your homes in storage is a great way to do it. But also culvert and pipe updates. You know, if there's a constriction under a road, like we saw the picture in the previous slide, we got to open those up. But the phasing is important because if we just go about opening culverts up, that is whack-a-mole. You sort of send that flow down the line, and we want to make sure that there's the quote is always no adverse offsite impacts, that everything we do is in a system. And that's the advantage of master planning versus, just trying to tackle whatever is the loudest or the problem of the day. When we look at a holistic system like this, the left hand knows what the right hand's doing, and the entire city's working in concert to solve the problems in a holistic way. So we then will provide preliminary costs for these projects, discuss the benefits, and then try to suss out which ones we want to try to tackle year one and which ones we could maybe wait until year 8, 9, 10 down the road. And when I say benefits, what does that mean? It's not just necessarily a home and a business being inundated, it's road passability. Our critical routes underwater for hours at a time when we need to get fire and other emergency vehicles through there. Are critical structures inaccessible? Is there a can we get into the hospital or schools underwater? How do we rate these sorts of things and say, well, there's a couple of different homes that are inundated and it's going to cost $20 million to fix that. Is that something that we want to tackle right away? Is it really a problem? That's really tough. The more I do in this business, it's less math and science, and it becomes very economic, political, and legal when you get into this type of analysis. So I have this little compass, if you will, about the projects that we can draw up in the model space. Because as a planner, I can make the model or anything else on the computer screen do anything I want to. We'll solve every single problem, but I don't want you to laugh at me when I come to you with the price tag for those sorts of things. So we want to avoid what's up there in this top left, like the albatross. It's high cost, it's difficult to build, it's politically difficult, and there's just not a lot of benefits. Likewise, there's going to be a few things that come out that we need to do ASAP. We know that's a slam dunk project. We're going to get those up year 1, year 2. But realistically, most projects are going to fall in the yellow areas where there's a big problem and it's a high benefit, but it's going to be difficult to do. And maybe it's going to require state revolving funds, ARPA money, some other grant sources that we can demonstrate that we can match with that devoted funding source. Or in that last corner there, not worth the time or money, maybe they're locally important and maybe they're inexpensive, but they just aren't the sorts of things we should do first. And at worst, in that bottom corner, you don't want them to be seen as like a pet project or the dreaded pork, right? So we're trying to find a nice center point on this compass where we tackle the big problems at the lowest cost possible in an expeditious way and benefit the community. So where are the projects? This map doesn't probably mean a whole lot to you until I overlay it with our council districts. So primarily, the way that planning works when we're talking about flooding is you do the most you can upstream to save things downstream. It's kind of the concept of a dam, right? You hold stuff back and detain it before it can get too far down the line, and it's hard to control. So in Commissioner Mullally district, there's the area right there that I was showing, that Sunnymead area that's very low. There's the Valley Center, which we saw flood in March of 2021. The upstream districts may have dirt turning in them, but of course, Commissioner Justice and Commissioner Trivett will see the benefits of those improvements upstream. It's holistic. It's master planning. That's about all I have to say, but I always throw this up there. I'm the communications chairperson for the Tennessee Stormwater Association. So these are my talking points. How can the public help out? The folks to you, I'll address this to everybody watching us today. How can you help the city out? Maintain a storm drain on your property. I mow my ditch and make sure that a lot of gravel doesn't get into my corrugated metal pipe at the front of my lawn. And if you're hanging out with your local troll under the bridge there and you see a larger drainage problem, take a picture of it, send it into Andy or Shane. I'm sure your email is ready to receive pictures like this. And then we can attack items like this blockage here. Because no matter what we draw up, we can draw up these magnificent solutions that are very elegant, brand new, but eventually the operations and maintenance that you're going to get as a benefit from having this enhanced program will be able to tackle these sorts of things and keep the solutions that we design operating as they should. And the last thing, be a conscientious fertilizer user. That's we're always talking about that in the Stormwater Association. So I think, Dave, you're kind of captaining this, but this is about our time for questions.
Yep. Yeah, so just kind of happy to answer any questions. We're looking to hear back, anything, feedback you have on the plan we've laid out today and some of the upcoming decisions that would need to be made about what the appropriate funding level is if you were to move forward and the timing of that.
Yeah, all the commission mics are on. Turn Mr. Barlow's on as well. So, any questions? Commissioner Hefner, do you have one? Or you may be stretching your arm. I don't
Maybe
know.
stretching my arm. I do have a question. Do you typically see an increase, a higher cost in the earlier years of fixing big problems, and then that tapers out over time?
It can. We set up the fee in order to be sustainable for at least the first 5 years. That's our goal. Because, of course, everything new that gets built is going to generate more revenue. So your fee is not going to be stagnant day one. It's going to go up. And so certainly you can't turn the switch on tomorrow and have everything ready to go and fund everything on day one. So there is a bit of a staging up that happens. So we set the fee to be sustainable for the first 5 years and recommend reevaluating at the end of 5 years to see where you are along your plan. And so, like with most of these, you don't see many fees drop over time. They usually stay the same. Some of them, we did Memphis 15 years ago, and they didn't raise their fee for over 10 years, stayed where it was. Yeah, there can be some upfront costs. A lot of the things, what we see sometimes is if there's a program that's really into capital, they may do some bonding right up front to accelerate getting those projects in the ground. And then so you're paying debt service over time. So we see that once in a while. So it really depends on what the priorities are in your community and how you want to do that. The benefit today is there's a lot of infrastructure money out there. Some of those applications will ask specifically, do you have a dedicated funding stream to support the maintenance of this program or this project over time? So it can be good timing to start to look at those things and have a program in place to do that.
Okay. And last question. Did I read that slide correctly? You're showing 2 full-time employees for this department, or am I misinterpreting that?
We were talking 2 full-time crews.
Crew, okay.
Maintenance crews.
Yeah.
So how many people?
Generally speaking, I know from when we met with Gallatin, met with them probably 4 years ago, talking about through this process. I think they had 3 men crews, and that's going to include some equipment, some road grading equipment, mini excavator, skid steer, stuff like that.
Okay. Is that what you factored in on your operating expenses?
Yep.
Okay.
It's factored in for 2 crews and then a department, the utility director, if you will, for the stormwater program. That's the staffing that we've forecasted in.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
So I actually have 2 questions, if that's okay. So the first one, which is going to be for, again, for the HOAs, because I know there's a lot of common space in my community right now. We've got about 27 acres. I know the county had just started basically taxing them for all the common space for the properties. So now we're, that's a couple of years back. So now we're looking at some additional taxing there. So with that, current properties actually does have 2 retention ponds. So again, I mean, is this going to be something that is going to be, as a baseline, or is it going to be, because you had mentioned a percentage. So is somebody going to come out and start doing surveys on these properties to do site assessments? How is that going to work out?
In terms of the fee reduction, what's
For
being
the
charged
fees
today or the
initially.
potential reduction. So guys, 2 things. One is any impervious area that's in the city would be charged a fee. So if it's on a individual single family lot, or if it's on an HOA property, that would be measured and charged a fee, because that's what generates the runoff. So your second question would be, so we measure that on an aerial photo. We're usually not out in the field wheeling that off. We can see that from an aerial photo. And so we measure that on the photo, and it's attached to the bill that goes to that property. And then the second thing, if you have retention ponds on site, as part of the credit manual, we would evaluate whether or not those properties would be entitled to a fee reduction based on that. And so that can be applied just to the common property, or, these are policy choices. We can apply it to the neighborhood. So everybody in the neighborhood gets a reduction of their fee. If you have those ponds, they're paying into the HOA that maintains those ponds, then they could be eligible as a resident of that community to get a fee reduction. So does that answer your question?
Kind of. Well, I mean, obviously there was some discussion with years past that, I guess the charges were originally pushed back to the individual homeowners of that community, and now it's pushed back to the HOA. So not all HOAs are well developed as well, having funding sitting there. So there's going to be some challenges there that I think the city, doesn't want to go back and start pulling funds from something that isn't developed to begin with. So would there be an option to go back to the actual homeowners that are part of that development and be able to just do it that way to eliminate the headache of a property management company having to go back through or if they don't have a property management company, it's just a small development type deal.
So for example, I guess what you're asking is, so if there's 30 homes in an HOA and there's impervious area on that common property, instead of paying $540, they're paying $560 or something, that's something we can work into the billing. So it's just a policy choice that you would have to make if we wanted to try to do that. But we would be able to identify those properties and say if they're attached to it or not. So that's a possibility. It's just a policy choice.
Now, Commissioner, I think one of the notes of that, contrary, I think where the county's going to tax for every single square foot you have, this is only going to be, I don't know, this isn't a tax, it's a fee, but this would only apply just to the impervious areas. I'm thinking like for Hickory Hills, for instance, any detention ponds, those are all green space. So that doesn't get factored into it. really it's going to be your impervious, like the building, the common buildings and stuff
Sure.
like that. So like I'm thinking about my old neighborhood, Normandy Heights. They have a pavilion. They've got a small basketball court and a little trail. That's the only thing that would be quantified in that. I'm thinking, total of that's probably just a few units worth. So you're talking, maybe 15 to 20-ish dollars a month probably for
Sure.
Normandy Heights, just for example.
I'm also looking at the same time our connecting community as well that has a lot of areas that could be potentially taxed as well. So just looking out for what's in my district. So Mr. Barlow, if you don't mind, so when you say you're going to have 2 to 3 crews, will they be only doing the maintenance side of it, or as well as some potential larger projects?
I would say the small projects. If you've got, I'm thinking about, if we're talking about, I'm thinking about Hillview subdivision, for instance, which is the one that we've talked about for a long time. It's an old subdivision. It's one of our oldest, and the ditches in there are mostly non-existent. Those all need to be. That's more of a community-wide kind of thing. I can see that be a capital project that we bid out. But if you've got some other areas where you say, oh, well, we just have maybe this one segment, maybe it's about 1,000-foot long area that we need to take care of, something like that. I can see that being our crews taking care of that kind of stuff.
Okay.
I can also see pipe replacements because our streets crews have done that over time, where if there's a lot of our older rusted out metal corrugated pipes, I know we've done some in some smaller streets in the past. Those are probably easy enough. If it gets into more substantial kind of stuff, we're talking just a lot more detailed type of work, probably not, but simple pipe replacements, roadside ditches, things like that are more isolated or limited in scope, I can see us knocking that out. That's more what I can see us doing.
All right, last question. So are we going to have to look at some additional buildings if we're going to be adding more equipment, more employees? That's going to be a possible another building. Is that correct?
So one of the things that we really wanted to look at, and we put it into this budget year, was looking for additional space for our public works facilities. And one of the things we're keeping in mind is we currently have sewer, streets, traffic, and roads right away divisions. And so this would be Stormwater would actually have its own maintenance crews. And so that additional shop space is what we've kind of envisioned. We're going to have to have that. We're basically out of space right now from an equipment standpoint, from sheds and things like that. That's why we ask for more space and more land. But it's our vision that all that is on one campus, one larger campus. All these aspects of public works is under one campus. It could be one more shop or maybe 2 more shops, but kind of what you see out on Clemens Road today, take something like that. Obviously, it's going to need to be a more substantial building than that to house all of our different divisions that we have. But that's the general idea of it. That's what we're trying to look at as far as growth. I think the land and stuff that we're looking at will take care of us for the next 15, 20 years.
Okay, thank you.
Vice Mayor?
Excuse me. I've got what myself and our city manager get every year, that sinus mess going on, so I apologize for my voice. Guys, my question is, and I'm not sure how this applies, but if we establish a utility other than what our sewer utility is, and that creates another enterprise zone, or enterprise fund, is that not correct?
That's correct.
Okay. One of the problems that I've got with that is that under state law, the way it works, if that enterprise fund does not continue in the green, if it goes over into the red 2 years, I think it is
2 consecutive, yeah.
2 consecutive years, then the state comes in and starts setting the rates. So, and I'm not sure how this is all going to play in, but what I worry about is that we're going to set an account, a fund, or a tax, if you would, and we're going to put that in place. We don't know what the actual costs are going to be. We don't know what the expenditures. We don't know anything about the revenue sources. I mean, this is all. So we're kind of out here. I'm afraid of establishing a new utility and putting ourselves in position to be governed or mandated by the state as to what those rates may be farther down the road before we have an opportunity to set them.
Yeah, I would say the revenue side is always very stable. It's probably the most stable form of revenue since it's not changing every month based on the weather or, you have water and sewer changes based on the use over time. Impervious area is what it is unless people start taking it away. So from a revenue side, it's very stable in terms of what we can forecast, what it is today. And it's only going to grow incrementally over time as you add impervious area. The only way it goes down is if you start tearing it out. So it is very predictable on the revenue side for what you're going to bring in on an annual basis. But the cost side is really, that's a budgeting process that happens every year, and staying within that budget framework.
Well-
Vice Mayor, I think to one of the things, and I'm not sure, I'd have to go back and look at this. I know the state statute that applies, one of the biggest issues that we have to account for with our sewer utility is depreciation. If it wasn't for depreciation, we would be fine. We actually have to take that into account every single year, and that's one of the things that can put you into the red. Now, of course, there's substantial depreciation when you're talking about sewer pump stations. All that stuff depreciates at a pretty short-term rate. With this kind of infrastructure, I think this is the kind of infrastructure that's not going to depreciate so quickly. But that's one of the things. I'm not sure if that only applies to water and sewer. I don't know if you guys know if that applies to stormwater facilities.
The ones I've implemented, they have not been paying depreciation. It's not been accounted for in the fund. I mean, it's some that I've seen. The more mature ones as they take over sort of ownership of the infrastructure over time, they'll start accounting for that. But brand new utilities, the ones I've worked on, they have not considered depreciation as a part of the revenue need.
And I understand what you're saying. I appreciate what you're saying. Like I said, the one thing I worry about is, is it a budgeting process is what the state goes by as far as our expenditures versus our revenues? Is that what they're going by, or are we looking at projects and the actual cost of the projects? I mean, how involved do they get into our internal workings?
I just only speak from my experience. I don't know any utilities in this stormwater utilities in the state that have had involvement from the state in terms. The only way I've seen the state get involved is if you have water quality issues and that sort of thing. So your state permit says you shall adequately fund your program, and that's all it says. And so for water quality, so if you were to have a violation on the water quality side, and you say, hey, well, this is all the money we have. In other states I've seen, especially in Virginia and the Chesapeake Bay area, the state will come in and assess fines and things like that, or say, hey, you have to raise your rate in order to cover it if you're saying you don't have enough money. But I've not seen that in Tennessee. They have not been.
Is that something we can investigate a little further before we go too far into this? I don't want to create another tax. I mean, we're already creating a utility, which is doing exactly that, but it's given the level of flooding that we've got is needed. I don't disagree with that part, but I want to make sure that we don't create an opportunity for the state of Tennessee to come in here and it would be the comptroller's office. It wouldn't be TDEC or any of those guys.
Right. Yeah.
Gino, I don't know how familiar you might be with that state statute that requires the basically operating in the green aspect of it. Dana could probably speak a little bit more to it. I'm sure she's probably kind of familiar with it, but as far as that, what we have to do basically is we have to go through a new rate study to verify based on that. Does that apply to stormwater?
It will. It'll be a separate enterprise fund, and it's got to operate in the green.
Okay. Now, I will say this, one of the things I know about sewer, and today's point on that, sewer fluctuates. If we have large rain events, which is kind of what we had a couple of very wet years. And so our bills to Metro were high. And as a result of that, we ended up having to pay more for those. While we collect based on that usage, it doesn't make up for that completely as far as, when you're collecting rainwater and you're paying Metro for rainwater, you're losing money. And so, because that's not flow that we're collecting from the individual homeowner.
It's infiltration.
That's right. And of course, while we're actually pretty good as an overall system in that regard, that still, when you have wet years, that puts you in that shape. And that's exactly what we experienced over those years. This past fiscal year, we're in fantastic shape, more than made up for the 2 prior years where we were at. And then this year's trending up in a good direction as well. So, and to this point, we're not in a situation where we're paying fees to another agency or having to treat stormwater based on the volume of rain we get. It's not a fluctuating kind of a thing. And the other thing about it is I know that what they look at is not the capital side of it. They look at the maintenance side of it. And I feel like the way that we have this structured in such a way is that based on revenue, I think that we're in a pretty good shape where our idea of it is that we have our basic function for running the program. But then as far as the maintenance and the capital projects, if we're in a tough year as far as collections go for some reason or another, or our development fees are really low in a specific year and that affects our total, then that would be reflected in the capital projects, and that fluctuation would be reflected in capital and not in O&M. So that's a safeguard for us to where we don't have to worry about being in that. So we can be very steady.
I just worry about creating anything that government's going to have to run in the green, because government is not the most efficient way of doing anything. So I want to make sure our bases are covered on that.
Question on this. Being that this is basically an independent utility district that we're creating through an enterprise fund, why does the city have to have any involvement in this? I mean, I think it would have to get chartered through somebody else, but it'd have to be a charter to establish it. But
Could there not be some independent group come in and create this
I will say
independent of us?
We are responsible to the state, whether we have the utility or not, for the water quality and water quantity.
so that kind of answers the question for
Yeah.
our advantage of having some control over this, setting the path, setting the objectives. Because I mean, I think of the other examples, West Susan Chiller District, which exists without us, but that's a charter through the state to do that. But anyway, Commissioner Mullally, we got a few minutes left here if you get some questions.
Just a couple of things. I'm excited about it, that it's finally here. It's been a year and a half, and it's badly needed, especially in my area. And I know there's lots of other areas around town that are hot spots for it. I just think it has to be done. I'm looking forward to moving forward on it. And what is your recommended A, B, or C on the level?
We recommended B on the program management.
Go back to that slide.
Yeah, go back to that slide, the recommendations. Program management and regulatory compliance recommended B. We felt like those were far and above better than where we're at now. I like the thought of those, and I'd rather put my money where my mouth is at and go for the A in the operation maintenance and the capital projects, because ultimately that's where the rubber meets the road on this is the projects and maintenance of the system.
Okay, so you're recommending B, but you would like to do A?
For the first two, those program management and regulatory, B level of service. And keep in mind, I mean, we're just meeting minimums today. So we're kind of CD level today on those. So we are stepping our game up on those.
Mhm.
But then the other aspect of it is for operation maintenance and capital improvement projects. I mean, we're taking everybody's value at their word, and what we believe in is let's have a great system in place. Let's run a little bit leaner on program management and regulatory, slightly so. I mean, I still think that's a very good exemplary system. But let's put max effort into operation maintenance and projects.
Okay. So what is the next step, and when do you expect it to come to BOC to move forward?
Great question on that. So our next steps, we have a ordinance that we're working through. We plan on having that for first reading. I think we're having that we're going to do last meeting in October for the first reading, and then that would be the first reading in November as passage. Is that right? Okay. So we're looking at having it passed first reading in November.
Okay. All right. That's all I had.
All right. Thank you, Commissioner. With that, looks like we've about hit our time right on the mark. Anything else you'd like to add?
I don't think so. Thanks, everybody. I really appreciate this. It's been a long time coming, and I know I'm excited about just seeing us make the projects happen, honestly.
All right. Well, with that, we will adjourn this workshop. We have a public hearing. It's at 6:15, and then the regular scheduled Board of Commissioners meeting will commence at 6:30. Thanks, everyone.